Police in Kenya have opened fire during fresh clashes with protesters in the capital, Nairobi. Police also used whips on the protesters. Demonstrations were there and due to be held across the country to mark the anniversary of pro-democracy protests back in 1990.
Ruto must go. Tell me how you want me to go. What do you mean? What do you mean by Ruto must go? How do I go?
First, it was West Africa. Now, East Africa is next. Kenya was supposed to be the stable one, the economic powerhouse of East Africa, the Western ally that did everything right. But right now, as we speak, millions of Kenyans are saying enough is enough, and the government is panicking. Massive protests have erupted across the nation, marking the first anniversary of the deadly 2024 finance bill demonstrations that shocked the world. But what is happening in Kenya is not just about taxes or corruption. It is about a generation that is tired of being told to wait for change that never comes. But what we are seeing is the same playbook that is being used across West Africa. And it all traces back to one man whose influence is spreading like wildfire across the continent. Before we continue, hit that like button to support our video. William Ruto has been Kenya's president since 2022. He came to power promising to help ordinary Kenyans.
500,000 Kenyans find themselves in urban settlements. And we already have a shortage of houses. So as Kenya Kwanza, we looked at the challenge and we decided to turn it into an opportunity. We've turned it into an opportunity to do several things. Number one, of course, to create jobs. Number two is to create affordable, low-cost houses.
To fix the economy, to create jobs for young people, to make life better. Instead, he has done the exact opposite. He has raised taxes on everything. He has made life more expensive for people who were already struggling. He has ignored the concerns of young Kenyans, who make up 75% of the population. Last year, in June 2024, Kenya saw some of the largest protests in its history, sparked by President William Ruto's controversial finance bill. This bill proposed sharp tax hikes that would crush ordinary Kenyans already struggling with rising costs. The youth, known as Gen Z protesters, organized on platforms like WhatsApp and TikTok, flooding Nairobi's streets with music, flags, and fury. But the response was merciless. Security forces fired live rounds, rubber bullets, and tear gas. Over 60 people died, dozens were abducted, and the nation was left shaken. The 2024 protests were supposed to be about taxes, but they became about something much bigger. Young Kenyans stormed parliament. They set buildings on fire. They forced the government to withdraw the bill. It was the biggest crisis of Ruto's presidency. International allies were alarmed. The government was shaken to its core. But the most important part is yet to come. 1 year later, on June 25, 2025, Kenyans returned to the streets to honor those lost and to keep the pressure on Ruto's government. The demands expanded beyond taxes to include systemic issues like corruption, increasing national debt, and police violence. In Nairobi, businesses shut down, roads were barricaded, and police clashed with protesters, leaving at least 8 dead and hundreds injured. The Kenya Human Rights Commission reported shootings in towns like Mayatu, 50 miles from the capital. It was not just a one-day flare-up, it was a signal that Kenya's youth are done with business as usual. But what is driving this relentless energy? Kenya's Gen Z is not just protesting for the sake of it. They are fed up with a political class they see as corrupt and out of touch. Kenya's debt is ballooning, scandals are rampant, and the cost of living is suffocating. With the memory of last year's violence still fresh, activists tortured, bloggers like Albert Ojwang dying in police custody, the anger on the streets becomes impossible to contain. However, what started as peaceful marches to honor the lives lost in last year's protests turned into something straight out of a war zone. The Day of Remembrance turned into something else when the riot police started firing live ammunition at teenagers. Tear gas canisters were thrown into crowds. Young people were beaten to death. The violence was not one-sided. Protesters pushed to the edge, fought back. They threw stones at armored police vehicles, set bonfires on major highways like Kenyatta Avenue, and tore down concrete barriers. In Kikuyu town, just 12 miles from Nairobi, enraged demonstrators stormed and torched a police station and a courtroom. In Metu, 50 miles from the capital, clashes left at least 2 dead from gunshot wounds, one protester bleeding out from a bullet to the abdomen. Across the city, smoke rose from at least 10 burned buildings as looters, some say hired goons infiltrating the protests, ransacked shops. The chaos was unreal. Human rights groups like Amnesty Kenya and the Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights report at least 16 people killed on June 25, 2025, most from gunshot wounds. Over 400 were injured, with 83 needing specialized treatment for wounds from live bullets, rubber bullets, and beatings. The stories were horrifying. A teacher died in police custody, an unarmed street vendor was shot dead, young people were being tortured in detention centers. The government declared war on its own youth. The images from Nairobi tell a story of a nation at a breaking point. Protesters ducking tear gas, police firing into crowds, buildings burning. But behind the flames, it is about a generation demanding accountability. They are not just mourning the dead, they are fighting for a future where their voices matter. The blood and tear gas on Nairobi's streets tell a story of rage and resilience, but there is a bigger spark igniting Kenya's youth. As they dodge bullets and mourn their fallen, many are looking to a figure 3,000 miles away, Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré. His fierce calls for African sovereignty and resistance against Western influence are reflected in Kenya's protests. Here's what makes this completely different from past Kenyan protests. This is purely a youth movement. No political parties, no traditional leaders, no foreign NGOs, just young Kenyans organizing themselves through social media. Gen Z in Kenya has grown up differently. They have seen the Arab Spring. They have watched successful protest movements around the world. They have seen what young people can accomplish when they organize effectively, and they have seen Ibrahim Traoré, the 34-year-old military leader who has become a hero to young Africans across the continent. Traoré talks about African dignity and youth empowerment. Those exact same words show up in protest chants in Kenya. That is not a coincidence. What we are witnessing in Kenya is not happening in isolation. It is part of a massive continental shift that is reshaping the entire African political landscape. From the Atlantic coast to the Indian Ocean, young Africans are challenging the status quo with unprecedented coordination and determination. The timing of Kenya's protests is particularly significant. They come at a moment when traditional power structures across Africa are facing their most serious challenges since independence. In West Africa, the military takeovers in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have created a new bloc of countries openly rejecting Western influence. In Central Africa, countries like Chad and Cameroon are seeing increased youth activism demanding political change. In Southern Africa, South Africa's ruling ANC is facing its worst electoral performance in decades, while Zimbabwe's youth are increasingly vocal about economic mismanagement. But East Africa was supposed to be different. Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda were seen as the stable core of the continent. Kenya in particular was the darling of Western donors and international investors. It had a relatively free press, a vibrant civil society, and regular elections. It was the regional hub for international organizations, multinational corporations, and diplomatic missions. The protests in Kenya represent a crack in what was considered the most stable region of Africa. The economic foundations of this stability are crumbling. Kenya's debt crisis is not unique. It mirrors problems across the continent. Sub-Saharan Africa's external debt has more than doubled since 2010, reaching over $700 billion, 0 cents. Countries like Ghana, Zambia, and Sri Lanka have already defaulted on their debts. Kenya is walking a tightrope, trying to meet its debt obligations while managing domestic pressure for increased spending on social services and infrastructure. This debt crisis has created a perfect storm for youth activism. Young Africans are watching their governments prioritize debt payments to foreign creditors over domestic needs. They see new hospitals and schools being built with Chinese loans while existing facilities crumble. They watch their natural resources being exported to pay for borrowed money that often ended up in the pockets of corrupt officials. The generational divide is particularly very evident in Kenya. President Ruto, at 58, represents a political class that came of age during the Cold War, when African leaders had to choose between Western and Soviet backing. Today's protesters, many born after 2000, grew up in a multipolar world where China, India, and other powers offer alternative models of development. They are less impressed by Western democracy and more interested in results. This generational shift is creating new forms of political organization. Traditional political parties in Kenya are struggling to connect with young voters who organize through WhatsApp groups, TikTok videos, and Twitter threads. These digital natives create horizontal networks that are harder for governments to co-opt or suppress. They share tactics, strategies, and inspiration across borders in real time. The influence of successful protest movements is immediate and direct. When young people in Kenya see their counterparts in Nigeria forcing their government to end the SARS police unit, or when they watch Sudanese youth topple a military dictatorship, they understand that change is possible. Social media has created a continental conversation about resistance that was impossible in previous generations. But the most significant factor is the ideological shift toward Pan-Africanism and economic sovereignty. Previous protest movements in Kenya focused on specific policies or leaders. The current movement is questioning the entire post-colonial economic structure. Young protesters are asking why Kenya exports raw materials and imports finished products. They want to know why foreign companies control key sectors of the economy. They are demanding that their government prioritize national interests over international pressure. Previous generations of African protesters focused on political rights and civil liberties. The current generation is combining these demands with sophisticated critiques of neocolonialism, debt dependency, and resource extraction. They are not just demanding better governance within the existing system, they are demanding a fundamentally different system. Traoré's appeal is not just about policy, it is about his persona. He is a powerful orator, mostly seen in military fatigues, speaking directly to the frustrations of a continent tired of neocolonialism. His message? Africa's resources should serve Africans, not Western corporations. The 2025 Kenya protests are not just about taxes anymore, they are about a generation questioning why a resource-rich country like Kenya is drowning in debt and poverty. Kenya and Burkina Faso are worlds apart. Burkina Faso is a military junta fighting jihadists in the Sahel. Kenya is a democracy, flawed but functional, with a vibrant civil society. So why is Traoré's name on Kenyan lips? It is because his message taps into a universal frustration, the feeling that African governments are puppets of Western powers. When U.S. AFRICOM Commander General Michael Langley visited Kenya in May 2025, he faced public outrage for criticizing Traoré. Kenyans saw it as proof of foreign meddling, echoing Traoré's warnings about imperialists and their cronies. Langley's comments about Traoré misusing Burkina Faso's gold reserves hit a nerve. Kenyan protesters, already angry about their own government's ties to Western institutions like the IMF, saw similarities. They are asking, why is Kenya's debt to foreign lenders growing while ordinary citizens struggle? Traoré's actions, like nationalizing mines and rejecting exploitative agreements, feel like a blueprint. But behind all the political drama, there is a fundamental economic crisis. Kenya's economy is in trouble. Kenya is facing a tough situation, a national debt that's ballooned to over $80 billion, 0 cents, high inflation, and unemployment rates that hit young people the hardest. A 2025 GeoPoll survey found that 49% of respondents, mostly young Kenyans, were unemployed and 67% had college degrees but couldn't find jobs. That's a recipe for discontent. When you are educated, ambitious, but stuck with no opportunities, you are going to get angry. Add to that the rising cost of living, food, fuel, housing, and it is no wonder people feel squeezed. The 2024 finance bill, which proposed taxes on essentials like bread and cooking oil, was the spark that lit the fire last year. Even though President Ruto backed down and scrapped some of those taxes, the underlying issues have not been fixed. In 2025, 57% of GeoPoll respondents said nothing had changed since the 2024 protests. Police brutality is another huge issue. The The 2024 protests saw over 60 deaths, with security forces accused of firing on unarmed demonstrators. A BBC investigation identified police officers who shot at protesters outside Parliament, killing people like David Chege and Erickson Mutisia, who posed no threat. In 2025, the violence continued, with 16 deaths reported by Amnesty Kenya, most from police gunfire. The death of blogger Albert Ojwang in police custody earlier in 2025 became a source of tension, with protesters demanding justice for him and others killed or abducted. The Kenyan National Police's heavy-handed tactics, live rounds, tear gas, water cannons, have only fueled the anger. Then there is corruption. Kenya's government has been plagued by scandals, from misappropriated funds to shady contracts. The public's trust in leaders is at an all-time low. President William Ruto, who came to power in 2022 promising to be a hustler for the common man, is now seen by many as part of the same old political class. Our protesters are calling out a system where elites live large while ordinary Kenyans struggle. Miron Elias from the International Crisis Group summed it up as, "These protests reflect a wholesale frustration with the political class. It is not just about one policy, it is about a system that feels rigged." The government's idea of raising the taxes will make life more expensive. It is like forcing people to pay for corruption and mismanagement. That is exactly what sparked these protests in the first place. But now the protesters are not just demanding lower taxes, they are demanding fundamental economic transformation. They want their resources to benefit ordinary Kenyans, not foreign companies and corrupt elites. And that demand is incredibly powerful, because it is not just about Kenya. It is about the entire post-colonial economic order. It is about how Africa relates to the global economy. International financial institutions are watching nervously. The World Bank and IMF have loan agreements with the Kenyan government. If massive protests force policy changes, what happens to those agreements? Foreign companies are also reassessing their strategies. Kenya is a major hub for international business in East Africa. If political instability spreads, it could disrupt the entire regional economy. But there is a deeper question. What kind of economic system are these young protesters fighting for? The anti-imperialist argument suggests a fundamental challenge to how Kenya has worked since independence. They are not just demanding better management of the current system, they are demanding a completely different system, one that prioritizes young Kenyans over foreign interests, one that uses national resources for national development. That is revolutionary thinking, and it is spreading across the continent from Kenya to Burkina Faso to Ghana. Kenya's current crisis represents more than a typical protest movement. It reflects a fundamental shift in how young Africans view their relationship with the state, the international community, and their own continental identity. The influence of Pan-African ideologies, particularly those championed by leaders like Traoré, has created a new model for political resistance that goes beyond national boundaries. The government's options are increasingly limited. Traditional methods of managing political opposition like co-optation, divide-and-rule tactics, and selective violence are proving ineffective against a decentralized movement inspired by continental ideologies. The protesters' rejection of dialogue offers and their resistance to ethnic and regional divisions suggest that conventional political solutions may not be sufficient. Violent repression remains an option, but it carries enormous risks. The deaths of protesters in 2024 and 2025 have already created martyrs for the movement and generated international criticism. Further violence could lead to even greater radicalization and could damage Kenya's international reputation as a stable democracy. The economic dimensions of the crisis also limit the government's options. The protesters' demands for debt cancellation and economic sovereignty cannot be met through simple policy changes. These issues require fundamental restructuring of Kenya's economic relationships, which would be difficult to achieve even with the best of intentions. As we watch the streets of Nairobi burn and count the bodies, we are witnessing something that could reshape the entire African continent. The massive Gen Z protests in Kenya represent more than anger at police brutality or economic hardship. They represent a fundamental challenge to the post-colonial order that has defined African politics for decades. Across the continent, young people are pushing back against governments they see as corrupt or beholden to foreign powers. In Nigeria, protests against economic hardship have echoed Kenya's demands for accountability. In Ghana and Liberia, solidarity rallies for Traoré denounced foreign interference, reflecting a shared frustration with neocolonialism. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, which includes Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, has become a symbol of this resistance, rejecting Western-dominated institutions like ECOWAS and the G5 Sahel. Traoré's leadership in this shift has made him a figurehead for Pan-Africanist movements. In Kenya, this Pan-Africanist sentiment is less direct but present. The 2024 and 2025 protests focused on local issues, but the anger at foreign debt and Western influence aligns with Traoré's stance. Kenya's debt to the IMF and World Bank is seen by some as a form of economic control, much like the CFA franc in West Africa. Traoré's rejection of such systems inspires Kenyans who want their government to prioritize national interests. The question of Ibrahim Traoré's influence remains partially unanswered, but the evidence is mounting that we are seeing a new form of political movement. The digital organizing, the advanced tactics, the Pan-African discussions, the sustained organization despite violent crackdowns. It all suggests a level of coordination and influence that goes beyond spontaneous domestic uprising. Whether this influence is direct or indirect, coordinated or inspirational, the impact is undeniable. The Kenyan protesters have sustained their movement for over a year despite violent crackdowns. That resilience is what makes this crisis so significant. Ibrahim Traoré, sitting in his palace in Ouagadougou, may or may not be directly orchestrating the protests in Nairobi, but his influence, his ideas, his model of youth leadership, his vision of African dignity is certainly part of the conversation. And that influence grows stronger with each successful protest, each act of police brutality that gets exposed, each young African who decides that change is possible. The question isn't whether this influence will spread, it's how quickly and how violently the old order will resist. The answer will determine not just the future of Kenya, but the future of Africa itself. The streets of Nairobi are still burning, the protests continue, the police still use violence against young people demanding basic rights. This is not just about Kenya or Traoré. It is about a generation across Africa saying enough is enough. From Ouagadougou to Nairobi, the fight for true independence, justice, and dignity is universal. So, what do you think? Is Traoré a revolutionary hero or a digital myth? Are Kenya's protests a new dawn or a temporary spark? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and share this video to spread awareness. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more videos about Africa's biggest stories.